Step aside. Lady, people like you always try something in here. The words came from Deputy Carl Benson before Judge Aisha N. Johnson could even set her briefcase on the table. He grabbed her arm, twisted it hard, and forced her face toward the cold frame of the metal detector. Her wrists were yanked behind her with deliberate pressure, the cuffs tightening until pain shot up her forearms. In that moment, with attorneys and clerks watching in frozen silence, Aisha felt the sting of humiliation rise through her chest like a slow burn. She did not shout. She did not resist. She stood still while Officer Derek Miller dragged his hands down her coat with a slow, mocking patience. Officer Ryan Hayes dumped her briefcase, scattering confidential files across the floor, and laughed under his breath as a single page slid to her feet. The bruise forming beneath the cuff edge would last for days, but the consequences for these men would last far longer. None of them knew that the woman they had just humiliated was the federal judge assigned to their civil rights case. None understood that these 28 minutes of arrogance and violence would strip them of everything they had spent their lives trying to protect. Before we go any deeper into this story, where are you watching from today? If this case moves you, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. It helps others find these stories, and it keeps this work alive. Judge Aisha N. Johnson left the Brooklyn Bridge City Hall station at 7:12 a.m. Her breath visible in the bitter winter air as she walked the familiar path toward 500 Pearl Street. She carried a long black wool coat, a cashmere scarf, and a briefcase filled with 400 pages of discovery in United States v. Miller and Hayes, the case she had studied until midnight. She expected a long day and a hard trial, but nothing in her training, not even her years as a federal prosecutor, prepared her for the violence waiting at the courthouse entrance. Benson had stopped her once earlier that month, but she had dismissed it as carelessness. Today, there was a smirk on his face and a quiet satisfaction in the way he blocked her path. She identified herself. She spoke with calm authority, yet he held her badge to the light as though he were examining forged currency. Miller stood nearby with a paper coffee cup, eyes cold. Hayes hovered slightly behind him. Both men were due in her courtroom for their trial that morning, yet neither expected that the woman in front of them was their judge. They saw only a black woman in a winter coat. They saw a target. Miller leaned close enough for her to smell the stale bitterness of his drink. He spat on the marble and murmured that she matched the description of a person they were told to look out for. Possible threat, possible disruption. When she opened her mouth to correct him, he silenced her with a barked order and spun her around, forcing her arms back so sharply her shoulder clicked. She stayed upright through will alone. Hayes pushed past her and dumped her briefcase, letting the contents fall in a cascade across the floor. He kicked a page aside with his boot. Attorneys in line looked away. Clerks pretended to check their phones. No one stepped forward. For 28 long minutes, she stood there in pain, wrists bruised, shoulders tense, dignity stripped away layer by layer, when they finally announced it was a mistake and released her. Benson tossed her badge on the table as if returning a lost item. Miller muttered that she should dress like a judge next time. Hayes offered no words at all. But silence is not innocence. Silence is choice. Aisha gathered every scattered page with steady hands. She lifted her torn coat collar and walked through the checkpoint without another word. On the far side, Jamal Carter waited, eyes wide, unable to believe what he had seen. She spoke with quiet resolve. Document everything. We open court at 9. Her voice carried no anger, only a steady understanding that the line had been crossed and the cost would soon unfold. She moved with the calm of someone who had endured humiliation before and refused to let it define her. She knew what this moment meant. She knew that men like Miller and Hayes built their lives on patterns of impunity, long protected by a system that tolerated their abuse. She also knew that their arrogance would be the very thing that ended their careers. They had drawn a line in front of the wrong woman. They had violated a judge on her way to court, and before the day was done, before the jury even took their seats, the truth would begin to unravel their defenses, stitch by stitch. Aisha stepped into the elevator, her wrists throbbing under the sleeves of her coat. She stood tall, breathing slowly, forcing her mind to settle before she reached the courtroom. She carried her pain quietly, not because she wanted to appear unshaken, but because she understood the weight of the moment. She could not allow emotion to blur her judgment. When the doors opened on the 23rd floor, she walked with measured steps toward chambers, aware that every move she made from now on must be deliberate. She knew the world would soon learn what happened at that metal detector. She knew the defense would claim misunderstanding. She knew the police union would call her biased. She knew the headlines would question her stability. She also knew that truth, once revealed, holds its ground. She sat at her desk long enough to inspect the bruise forming beneath her wrist. She let herself feel it, not the pain itself, but the memory it carried. Her father, beaten by police in 1992. Her law school years spent studying cases of misconduct. The promise she made at her confirmation hearing to protect the Constitution without fear or favor. Today would test that promise. At 8:45 a.m., she rose, corrected her coat, and gathered the corrected files Jamal had already reorganized. She thanked him with a quiet nod. No dramatic words. No expression of fear. Aisha lived through too much to be shaken by men like these. She understood what they were. She understood what they believed they could get away with. But she also understood the law, and she understood the power of evidence. When she stepped through the side door of the courtroom at 9:10 a.m., the room fell silent. Reporters stared. Defense counsel blanched. Miller and Hayes slowly realized what they had done. Aisha took her seat with calm authority and called the case. Her voice was steady, her judgment unclouded. The trial was set to begin, and so was their unraveling. Miller felt the first crack of fear when the side door opened and Judge Aisha N. Johnson stepped into courtroom 23B, wearing the same torn coat they had mocked hours earlier, her wrists still marked by the cuffs they had tightened. The courtroom went silent in a single breath. Reporters froze with their pens midair. Defense counsel stared at her with widening eyes. Aisha walked to the bench with calm, deliberate steps, the measured stride of someone who had already decided she would not let humiliation guide her judgment. All rise. The words echoed, and every person in the room rose. Miller whispered to Hayes, "That's her? We're finished." His voice trembled. The first sign of a man who finally understood that the violence he thought was invisible had found its witness. Aisha looked directly at them, her expression still, her tone controlled, her presence undeniable. Case 123, CR 00876, United States versus Derek Miller and Ryan Hayes. Charges include conspiracy against rights under color of law and falsification of records. Are the parties ready? Defense counsel rose too quickly, as though startled by his own body. Your Honor, sidebar. Aisha shook her head with a slow firmness. Denied. The single word reclaimed the space. It reminded everyone that justice does not pause to protect the comfort of men who have spent years exploiting silence. She allowed no delay. She allowed no retreat. She moved the trial forward with a clarity shaped by years of endurance and a morning that had stripped away every illusion these officers had about how power shields them. The first witness entered. A young black man, 23. Shoulders still uneven from the collarbone that Miller had broken during a routine stop. His voice shook, but he spoke with the honesty of someone who no longer cared whether the courtroom believed him. Pain had already taken the place of fear. The defense attempted to object to his testimony, but Aisha silenced them with a calm reference to established procedure. Then she instructed the clerk to play the body camera footage. A file the department had claimed was lost, deleted, irrecoverable. Yet here it was, restored by Jamal Carter, who had stayed in chambers until dawn, piecing it back together with methods the department did not know he understood. The screen lit the room. Miller's fists appeared. Hayes's laughter followed. The young man on the ground cried out when the blow landed. The jury watched with a silence so complete it seemed to pull the air from the room. Aisha watched them, not the screen. She saw the slow tightening of their jaws. She saw their bodies lean back with instinctive recoil. Truth, when finally shown, carries its own force. When court adjourned, reporters rushed to the hallway. Miller's lawyer avoided them. Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Aisha walked to her chambers with quiet steps, refusing any offer of escort. She closed the door behind her and exhaled slowly. Her wrists throbbed. Her shoulders ached from the way Miller had forced them that morning. But pain is not the measure of harm. Dignity is. She sat at her desk long enough to remove her coat and fold it neatly, the torn collar hidden beneath the fabric. She refused to let the damage take center stage. She believed in restraint. She believed in resolve. She believed in the power of law to expose those who misuse it. But even she was not prepared for what happened next. Her phone buzzed. No caller ID. She answered because judges answer calls they do not expect. A man's voice. Low. Controlled. "Recuse yourself," he said, "or your daughter at Bronx Science pays the price." The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a chilling calm. The kind of tone that belongs to someone who assumes the law bends in his direction. Aisha did not respond. She ended the call. She placed the phone face down on her desk. For a moment, she sat motionless, letting the threat settle in the air so she could study its weight. Fear did not claim her, but it pressed against the edge of her composure. She knew the call came from someone who understood her life, her child, her schedule. This was not random cruelty. This was strategy. When Jamal knocked softly and entered, he saw that something had shifted in her expression. Not broken, not shaken, but sharpened. He placed a new stack of documents on the desk, observing the faint marks on her wrists. "Your Honor," he said quietly. "I checked the server logs. Something was wiped this afternoon." His voice carried a restrained urgency, as though he did not want to alarm her but could not hide the truth. She listened, absorbing each detail with measured calm. Others might have cried. Others might have taken immediate leave. But Aisha reached for a legal pad and began writing. She understood that corruption thrives when fear closes the door on justice. She would not close that door. That evening, the courthouse halls emptied. The fluorescent lights hummed. Aisha remained in chambers reviewing motions, transcripts, and the digital reconstruction of the footage. She saw the exact moment Miller's arm rose. She saw Hayes stepping back to avoid being caught in frame. She saw the pattern of behavior she had spent her career prosecuting. She saw evidence that matched testimony from dozens of cases previously dismissed for lack of corroboration. A pattern long ignored. A pattern tolerated. A pattern now illuminated because arrogance blinded these men to the identity of the woman they assaulted. Her daughter texted her at 7:48 p.m., home from practice, studying. "Love you." Aisha typed a simple reply. "Love you too. Be safe." She did not tell her what happened. She did not mention the threat. She guarded her child's innocence with the same devotion that guided every ruling she made. She then informed security of the call, documented it, and requested protective review procedures without disclosing more than necessary. She knew what steps to take. She had taken them for victims in her courtroom for years. Now she took them for herself. Near midnight, she reviewed the order she planned to issue the next morning. She wrote it slowly, weighing each sentence, ensuring every word reflected fairness rather than personal injury. She refused to let anger stain the judicial record, yet she allowed truth to enter it without apology. in the quiet of those late hours. She understood something deeper. The violence against her that morning was not a personal insult. It was part of a system that believed power belonged to those who enforced it, not to those who upheld the law. And now that system had revealed itself. The courtroom tomorrow would not only examine Miller and Hayes, it would examine everyone who protected them, everyone who erased complaints, everyone who claimed footage was missing, everyone who threatened her child. Aisha closed the file and stood. Her body was tired. Her mind was firm. Tomorrow, the trial would continue. And tomorrow, the blue wall that shielded these men would begin to show the fractures she had always suspected. She turned off the lamp, walked to the door, and whispered a single line to herself, not out of fear, but out of resolve. This ends now. Midnight settled over the 24th floor as Judge Aisha N. Johnson sat alone beneath the dim desk lamp, reviewing the fragments of a system she could no longer ignore. The silence of her chambers felt heavy, as though the building itself understood the weight of what had begun in courtroom 23B. Jamal entered without speaking at first, carrying an external drive with both hands, as if it contained something fragile. He placed it gently on her desk. "The main server was wiped at 2:14 this afternoon," he said, his voice quiet but steady. But Lydia Ramirez mirrored everything before the purge. Aisha opened the files, each image sharpening into view. The footage was clear, too clear. It showed Deputy Benson ordering her detention with open disdain. It showed Miller forcing her wrists behind her with unnecessary force, his hands lingering in places that had nothing to do with safety. It showed Hayes laughing as her briefcase hit the floor. It showed clerks looking away, pretending not to see, every second of humiliation preserved with painful precision. Jamal stepped back, watching her take in each moment. He knew she carried her dignity like armor, but he also knew dignity did not make bruises fade faster. She felt the pressure of those 28 minutes settle into her chest again, but she did not look away. She forced herself to watch the entire recording because she had spent her career asking others to do the same. She examined the angles, the timestamps, the sound, the patterns. She saw how Miller shifted his body to block the nearest camera. She saw Hayes signal to Benson with a subtle nod. She saw a choreography of misconduct shaped by years of practice, smooth enough to look routine to anyone unwilling to look closely. But she was willing. A soft knock interrupted the stillness. Detective Maria Ria Gonzalez stepped inside. Her winter coat flecked with melting snow, her expression one of exhaustion mixed with a resolve she had built over 19 years of surviving within the same department now on trial. Aisha rose to greet her, offering the dignity Gonzalez had been denied for too long. Gonzalez spoke before sitting. "I brought these," she said, placing a small USB drive on the desk. 17 recordings, Miller and Hayes, their own voices. She swallowed, her breath shaking. They talk about planting drugs, about beating suspects who didn't show respect, about how internal affairs would lose the complaints before anyone asked questions. Aisha listened with the practiced patience of someone who had spent her life hearing stories of injustice, but she also felt something deeper, not shock. Confirmation. Gonzalez continued. "They know I filed reports. They know I recorded some of their conversations. My son was doxxed this afternoon. My address posted online." She paused, steadying herself. "I came here because I am out of places to go." Aisha motioned for her to sit. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Her tone carried the weight of truth, not comfort. She connected the USB. Audio played through her computer speakers. Miller's voice filled the room first. Calm, casual, confident, planted, no camera this time. Then Hayes, laughing. "Say he reached." They'll believe it. The casual cruelty in their voices felt colder than the wind outside. These were not men who slipped once. These were men who had refined a method protected by the walls of a precinct and the silence of a courthouse. Aisha saw the pattern stretching backward through years of cases, years of accusations dismissed, years of evidence disappearing into digital voids, and now, by their own arrogance, the truth had landed on her desk. Gonzalez looked at Aisha with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. "If I testify, everything changes," she said. "But I also know what happens to people who do what I'm doing." She hesitated. "My son is 12. The words trembled in the air. Aisha felt their weight. She understood the danger that came when someone decided to pierce the blue wall. She also understood the duty that came with her role. "You and your son will be protected," Aisha said with quiet certainty. "I will request United States Marshal supervision tonight." Gonzalez nodded, her shoulders lowering by a fraction. She had carried her fear alone for too long. As the night deepened, snow drifted across the windows overlooking Foley Square. Aisha stood for a moment, watching the soft whiteness blur the city lights. She thought of her daughter studying in their Bronx apartment, unaware of the phone call that threatened her safety. She thought of her father, beaten in 1992 by officers who never faced discipline. She thought of every witness she had listened to, every victim whose stories had been reduced to paperwork until proof emerged. Tonight she was no longer the distant judge sitting above the well of the court. She was part of the evidence, and she knew the implications. She turned back to the table. "We need to protect everyone involved," she said to Jamal and Gonzalez. "Ramirez, you, your son, and anyone else caught in this net." She wrote the first orders herself, her handwriting clean and steady. She arranged emergency witness protections. She scheduled a private meeting with federal security. She prepared a sealed motion regarding the server purge. She considered every angle because she understood how corruption responds when cornered. It does not fade, it fights. Jamal handed her a printed log. "This shows the exact moment the server was erased." He said, "And it shows who had access." Aisha scanned the names: Benson, Miller, Hayes, a system of permissions crafted to grant them control and shield them from oversight. "There's more," Jamal added. "Ramirez said Chief Judge Harlan has been making personal inquiries about this footage for weeks." Aisha paused. She felt the shift. Corruption did not stop at the checkpoint. It reached higher. She sat again, letting everything settle in quiet layers. The abuse at the magnetometer was not an isolated act. It was a symptom. The wiped server was not sabotage by panicking officers. It was protocol. The recordings Gonzalez carried were not new behaviors. They were habits. Protected habits. Institutional habits. Aisha inhaled slowly. She knew she could recuse herself. She knew she could walk away and hand the case to another judge who would inherit both the danger and the chaos. She also knew that stepping aside would send a message to every victim who ever doubted the system. Even a judge, with power and law behind her, could be intimidated into silence. She looked again at her bruised wrists. They were still tender, but pain was not weakness. Pain was memory, and memory guides judgment. She turned to both of them. "We proceed," she said, "no matter how deep this goes." Gonzalez lowered her head with visible relief. Jamal exhaled slowly. The three of them understood the magnitude of what had begun. The trial was no longer about two officers. It was about a decade of concealed misconduct, stretching from a precinct to the upper floors of the courthouse itself. Aisha issued the final order of the night. United States Marshal protection for Gonzalez and Ramirez, immediate data preservation, and sealed testimony protocols. When the last document was signed, she shut down her computer and stood. Her body felt heavy, but her purpose felt sharper than it had in years. She whispered to herself, "They think they broke the right woman." She reached for her coat. They didn't. By the end of the week, the storm around Judge Aisha N. Johnson no longer lived inside the courthouse walls. It spilled into headlines, television panels, donor meetings, and backroom conversations where power brokers spoke in low tones about controlling the narrative before it consumed them. The New York Post ran its first attack piece at dawn. Federal judge accuses hero cops of assault. No evidence, the headline declared, followed by a photograph of Miller in full uniform holding a rescued puppy from a staged community event 5 years earlier. Cable networks repeated the story before breakfast. Commentators on morning shows referred to Aisha as emotional, aggressive, or unfit for objectivity. By afternoon, a Fox News panel held up her torn coat as proof she was manufacturing victimhood for political gain. No one mentioned the video they had not yet seen. No one asked why the server had been wiped. No one questioned why a sitting federal judge would risk her career on a false accusation. The truth did not matter. The narrative had already been built. The Police Benevolent Association spent $2 million on ads demanding her immediate recusal, calling her biased against law enforcement. Their message echoed through social media with paid amplification. She is not a judge. She is an activist in robes. Aisha read each headline without reaction, but Jamal saw the exhaustion forming behind her eyes. The attacks escalated faster than the court could process motions. Her SUV, parked outside her Bronx apartment, was vandalized with spray paint reading, "Traitor." Neighbors who once waved politely now turned their eyes away, not from agreement, but from fear. At 4:12 p.m. on a Wednesday, her daughter received a text message from an unknown number. It contained a photo taken from across the street, aimed at their apartment window. The caption said only, "Nice view." Aisha's body went still when she saw it. She tightened her grip on her phone and called the United States Marshals without hesitation. That night, her daughter was moved to a secure federal hotel with a plain hallway, a locked door, and a protection detail outside. Aisha hugged her child longer than usual before stepping back into the cold. She did not mention the threat. She did not explain the danger. She only said, "You are safe. That is all that matters tonight." Back at the courthouse, her chambers became a fortress of documents, recordings, and sealed filings. No personal calls, no unannounced visitors. Every knock was verified before she answered. Even then, she opened the door only a few inches. Fear had not taken root in her, but caution had. She was a mother. She was a daughter. She was a judge shaping a case that threatened careers, pensions, connections, and reputations that had been protected for decades. People did not surrender that kind of power peacefully. Chief Judge Robert Harlan summoned her to his chambers on Thursday morning. She entered with measured calm. Harlan did not rise to greet her. He kept his eyes on a stack of newspapers, each filled with commentary attacking her integrity. "Aisha," he said, finally looking up. "This has gone too far." His voice carried the tone of a man who believed he still held authority over her decisions. "You are embarrassing the courthouse. You are jeopardizing public trust. You are forcing this institution into a political war we cannot afford." She met his gaze without blinking. "I am upholding the law," she said, "if that embarrasses anyone. The problem is not the law." Harlan leaned back, frustrated. "Recuse yourself. End this. I can assign another judge. This all disappears." She paused long enough to let the weight of her next words settle. "No, Chief, for the first time. The courthouse is becoming honest. That is what scares you." Harlan's jaw tightened. He pushed a document across the desk. "Then understand the consequences. The union is furious. The mayor's office is calling. The district attorney is calling. Even the governor's legal counsel reached out. They are concerned about the court's stability. They want you gone from this trial." Aisha placed a single finger on the edge of the document. She did not read it. Pressure from those who benefit from silence is not a reason to abandon duty. She said. Harlan exhaled, irritated. "You are making this personal," Aisha answered with steady clarity. "They made it personal when they put their hands on me and then threatened my child." Silence filled the room. Harlan broke it only to say, "This will cost you." She turned toward the door. "Then let it cost me." but it will cost them more. Outside the chief judge's chambers, reporters waited behind barricades, their breath clouding in the winter air. They called her name, shouting questions about bias, misconduct, and supposed conflicts of interest. Aisha did not stop. The wind carried their voices behind her as she entered the building again, the echoes fading into the long hallway leading to her chambers. She had work to do. The attacks, the threats, the political pressure. None of it changed her responsibility. The system had failed too many people for too long, and she refused to allow one more case to be buried under false narratives. Later that evening, Jamal stepped into her office, holding a folder with trembling hands. This came from the district attorney's office. He said, "A formal request for you to step aside. They claim public perception makes you unfit." Aisha opened the folder, scanned the letter, and placed it aside. "They are protecting themselves," she said softly. "Not justice." Jamal hesitated. "Are you safe?" She looked at him with a calm that came not from denial, but from certainty. "I am safer standing in truth than stepping away from it." Outside the courthouse, protest lines grew. Black Lives Matter activists demanded transparency. Back the Blue supporters held signs accusing her of destroying good officers. New York City Police Department barricades separated the two groups as helicopters circled overhead. None of this noise entered Aisha's voice the next morning when she took the bench. She wore a new coat. She held her notes with steady hands. She opened court with the same formal calm she had carried since her appointment. She did not mention the headlines. She did not reference the threats. She did not acknowledge the political pressure. She simply said, "We will proceed," and for the first time. The courthouse understood that this case was no longer about two officers. It was about the truth itself. It was about a woman who refused to step aside. It was about a system that trembled because she would not kneel. Day 12 of the trial began with a quiet tension that settled over courtroom 23B like a held breath. Judge Aisha N. Johnson entered with the same controlled composure she had carried since the first day. Yet everyone sensed a shift. Her steps were steady, her expression calm. But beneath that calm lay the weight of what she intended to reveal. Reporters filled every bench. Lawyers whispered predictions they knew were speculative at best. Miller and Hayes sat rigid at the defense table, their uniforms replaced by plain suits that could not conceal their unease. Miller's jaw clenched each time he glanced toward the bench. Hayes tapped his foot so quickly it appeared to tremble. Aisha opened the session with a formality that left no room for interpretation. "We will resume where we left off," she said. "Please prepare the exhibits." Her tone carried the kind of quiet certainty that tells a room change is coming. No one knew how close that change was. At 10:14 a.m., she gave a single instruction to the clerk. "Play the full security recording, not the fragments shown earlier, not the partial clips the defense had tried to dismiss. The full 28 minutes. The room dimmed as the screens brightened. The footage began with Aisha approaching the magnetometer that morning. The courtroom watched as Benson blocked her path, his expression dismissive, his tone laced with authority he had no right to wield. Then Miller entered the frame. He twisted her wrists behind her with force that made several jurors flinch. Hayes dumped her briefcase, scattering every page, on the recording. No one intervened. No one objected. No one questioned the violation happening in plain view. Aisha sat still as every second replayed. She did not avert her eyes. She let the jury see her humiliation as it occurred, not to evoke sympathy, but to reveal the truth behind the charges. Several jurors covered their mouths. One wiped away tears. A reporter stopped typing mid-sentence. The courtroom, often restless, became completely still. Silence followed the final frame. Then everything broke. Miller shot to his feet, his voice cracking with desperation rather than rage. "She's lying! We were told she was a threat!" "We didn't know." His attorney tugged his sleeve frantically, but the unraveling had already begun. Aisha lifted her gavel and struck it once, the sound echoing through the room like a warning shot. "Sit down. Officer Miller," she said, each word measured and firm, "or you will be removed in chains." For the first time. Miller understood the depth of the authority he had mocked. His knees bent. He sat. His hands shook. The prosecution called its next witness, Lydia Ramirez. She stepped into the courtroom with visible fear in her posture, but her voice carried the strength of someone who had decided truth mattered more than safety. She explained, step by step, how she had backed up every file from the courthouse server, how she had watched the deletion logs appear minutes before the court's IT maintenance window, how the overriding protocols matched the credentials assigned to Miller and Hayes. Defense counsel objected repeatedly, but each objection fell flat under the weight of documented evidence. Ramirez's testimony was followed by the entrance of Detective Maria Gonzalez. She carried a small black case containing the 17 recordings she had risked her career to obtain when the first recording played. Miller bragging about fabricating probable cause. Hayes covered his face with his hands. When the second recording revealed them discussing drug planting, members of the gallery gasped. When the third recording captured laughter over a complaint from a mother whose son had been beaten, even the defense attorney lowered his head. Gonzalez spoke with steady gravity. "This is not new behavior," she said. "This is repeated behavior. Protected behavior." The atmosphere shifted once again when the courtroom doors opened quietly. Two assistant United States attorneys from the Civil Rights Division stepped inside. Their presence alone drew whispers, but the envelope they carried silenced every sound. They approached the clerk, presented the sealed documents, and stepped aside. Aisha read the contents without a change in her expression. Then she looked toward the gallery. Her voice, though calm, carried unmistakable weight. "Let the record reflect that a federal grand jury has issued a subpoena for Chief Judge Robert Harlan's financial records and communications with the Police Benevolent Association." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Defense counsel tried to stand, but Aisha lifted her hand. "Order." The room quieted instantly. In the corridor outside, the consequence of that subpoena unfolded in real time. Chief Judge Harlan attempted to leave through the side exit, his coat half-buttoned, his face drained of color, but two FBI agents stood waiting. They spoke to him quietly, professionally, and guided him away from the door. Reporters followed at a distance, their cameras capturing the moment. A powerful man understood he could no longer control the narrative he had tried to shape. Inside the courtroom, Aisha continued the proceedings without referencing the commotion outside. Her control anchored the room. She returned her attention to the jury. "You have now seen and heard evidence previously withheld. You must evaluate it carefully, without fear and without favor." Her words, though directed at the jury, were meant for the entire courthouse, the clerks who looked away, the officers who stayed silent, the administrators who buried complaints, and the leaders who traded justice for protection. As she concluded the day's session, she felt the weight of her morning bruises and the threat made against her daughter, yet she carried neither into her tone. She simply said, "Court is adjourned," and tapped her gavel once more. The sound reverberated through a system that had long believed it could act without consequence. Outside, the winter wind cut across Foley Square. Reporters shouted questions, protesters chanted, officers whispered among themselves, and in the center of it all, Aisha walked with quiet determination. The blue wall had begun to crack, not from force, but from exposure, not from anger, but from truth, not from vengeance, but from justice. Her steps that afternoon marked a turning point not just in the trial, but in the very institution she had sworn to protect. For the first time in decades, the Southern District of New York saw its own shadows clearly, and shadows, once seen, can no longer hide. Sentencing day arrived with a solemn weight that neither snow nor silence could soften. And when Judge Aisha N. Johnson stepped into courtroom 23B, every person present understood that the case had moved beyond guilt. Today was about consequence. Real, irreversible consequence. Miller stood at the defense table in a wrinkled suit that failed to dignify the man he had once pretended to be. His hands shook, his posture sagged. He looked smaller than he had at any point during the trial, as though the accumulation of evidence, testimony, and his own unraveling had finally pressed him down to his true size. Hayes stood beside him, eyes fixed downward, his lips pale, his breath shallow. He had cooperated late in the process, but not early enough to escape the weight of what he had done. Benson was absent, transported from a federal holding facility under medical observation. The room felt colder for it. Aisha began with the same calm she carried through every phase of the trial. She read the charges, the findings, the statutes. Her voice did not rise. It did not soften. It held the steady rhythm of truth, long withheld and now immovable. She addressed Miller first. Derek Miller, the court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and your history of misconduct. You engaged in repeated violations of constitutional rights under the color of authority. You falsified records. You inflicted physical and psychological harm. You attempted to obstruct justice. You acted with intention. Miller lifted his eyes for a moment, just long enough to reveal regret unaccompanied by accountability. The courtroom remained silent. Jurors watched with grave focus, aware they had participated in a turning point. Aisha continued, "It is the judgment of this court that you serve 120 months in federal custody. You will forfeit your pension. You will pay restitution in the amount of $2.8 million. You will be subject to supervised release. You will lose the badge you misused." The words struck harder than any gavel. Miller's face collapsed into a look of disbelief, as though he had expected the familiar protection of the blue wall to cushion his fall. But there was no wall left. Then she turned to Hayes. He trembled slightly, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "Your Honor, I cooperated. I tried to." She lifted her hand gently. "Mr. Hayes, the court acknowledges your late cooperation, but cooperation does not erase the harm you chose to enable. You knew what was happening. You remained silent. You allowed violence to occur. You hid evidence. You threatened the safety and dignity of those you were sworn to protect." Hayes nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. Aisha delivered the sentence with the same clarity as before. "It is the judgment of this court that you serve 96 months in federal custody. Your pension and benefits are revoked. Restitution is ordered. You will no longer serve in law enforcement." Hayes closed his eyes as though bracing for a wave large enough to pull him under. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but the gesture offered little comfort. Aisha then addressed the third man whose conduct had shaped the case. "Deputy Carl Benson is hereby sentenced to 72 months in federal custody for obstruction, falsification of security records, and repeated civil rights violations. His pattern of racially discriminatory actions, spanning more than 2 decades, reflects a profound abuse of power. Benson, watching by video feed due to illness, lowered his head 11 months later. He would die of a heart attack in custody. The institution he had served with arrogance did not mourn him. There were no vigils, no eulogies, only a note in the system marking his death." The courtroom shifted as Aisha prepared for the final announcement. The air tightened. Reporters lifted their pens. Observers leaned forward. The door opened quietly, and 2 federal officers escorted in a man whose presence had once commanded halls of polished marble, Chief Judge Robert Harlan. His hair, once meticulously combed, appeared thinned and disordered. His suit, though tailored, sat awkwardly on his shoulders. He looked around the room not with superiority, but with the hollow realization that the institution he wielded had exposed him. Aisha regarded him without triumph or emotion. "Robert Harlan," she began. You held the highest judicial office in this district. You were entrusted with oversight, accountability, and the integrity of this courthouse. She paused long enough for the gravity to settle. Instead, you accepted financial contributions from the Police Benevolent Association while overseeing cases involving officer misconduct. You obstructed investigations. You pressured judges. You attempted to suppress evidence. Harlan's lips parted slightly, as if he might speak, but he remained silent. For these actions, you are sentenced to 84 months in federal custody, followed by forfeiture of your judicial title and all related privileges. His shoulders fell with the quiet collapse of a legacy undone. The final figure addressed was Manhattan District Attorney Emily Ford. She stood with stiff posture, her political poise unable to mask the fear beneath. She was not being sentenced for a crime, but was called forward for formal censure. District Attorney Ford knowingly used her office to obstruct the release of legitimate complaints regarding the defendants. She acted in concert with political actors to influence public perception of the case. Ford's chin trembled, Aisha concluded. This court issues a formal reprimand and refers the matter to the State Oversight Commission. You are hereby censured. Ford would resign within weeks, losing her re-election bid by 40 points and eventually taking work defending insurance companies at a fraction of her former salary. When the proceedings ended, the courtroom remained still. The sentences had not only punished individuals, they had pierced a system that relied on secrecy, habit, and fear. The echo of consequence lingered in every row. Aisha closed the session with a tone softened only by truth. Justice is not comfort, she said. Justice is accountability. When she stepped into her chambers, the door closed behind her with a quiet sound that felt heavier than usual. She removed her robe and sat, resting her hands on the desk. Her wrists still bore faint discoloration from the assault weeks earlier. She touched the marks gently, not with anger, not with pride, but with recognition. She had sentenced the men responsible. She had confronted the institution that protected them. And yet, the toll remained. She required 2 years of therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Loud footsteps in courthouse hallways made her pulse quicken. The metallic click of handcuffs still caused her breath to catch. Healing was not linear, it was steady. Private work. But the consequences she delivered today ensured that the harm she endured would not be repeated without resistance. Her pain became testimony. Her endurance became precedent. Her judgment became the warning the system had long needed. And though the trial was over, she understood something deeper. Justice does not end with sentencing. It begins there, 1 year later. The winter wind moved differently around 500 Pearl Street, as though the courthouse itself carried a quieter, steadier breath. The protests had faded. The barricades were gone. Yet the memory of what happened inside those walls still lived in every hallway, every courtroom, every whispered conversation between young clerks who had entered the profession with clearer eyes because of Judge Aisha N. Johnson. A bronze plaque now stood at the entrance, simple in design yet profound in message, Civilian Complaint Review Board, Southern District Oversight Office. It marked the first time in the court's history that civilian oversight had been woven directly into its structure. No one spoke of it as a gift. It was a reckoning, a boundary, a promise that the days of buried complaints and missing footage were no longer the accepted norm. Officers entering the building now wore tamper-proof body cameras without exception. Their footage streamed to an independent federal server beyond their reach. Internal affairs had lost its gatekeeping power. Attorneys who once rolled their eyes at misconduct claims now approached such allegations with the seriousness they deserved. Reform, once considered a fragile hope, had become daily practice inside her chambers. Aisha N. Johnson reviewed a new docket, her handwriting steady, her focus unwavering. She had been confirmed as Chief Judge of the Southern District of New York, the first black woman in its history to hold the position. The Senate vote came with praise, analysis, criticism, and all the noise she had learned to filter. She accepted the role not for ceremony, but for responsibility. Yet she refused the lavish celebration the court planned. She did not need applause. She needed integrity. She needed truth rooted firmly enough that it could not be swept aside the next time someone decided a complaint was inconvenient. Her chambers now held 2 new staff members assigned to oversight coordination. Jamal remained her senior clerk, more confident than the young man who once trembled bringing her evidence of corruption. Lydia Ramirez now worked under federal protection in an expanded IT role. Her mirrored drive protocol adopted district-wide. Detective Maria Gonzalez had been reassigned to the Federal Task Force on Civil Rights. Her courage finally acknowledged by the institution that once marginalized her. Each of them represented a thread in the web of truth that had lifted the courthouse into a new era. Yet change came with cost. Aisha still felt the echo of her trauma each morning when she fastened her coat. She still paused when passing the security checkpoint, even though every officer now rose when she approached. She still heard the metal click of handcuffs in her memory, sharp and sudden, even when no sound existed. Healing, she learned, was not a moment. It was a long, steady discipline. She met with her therapist twice a week. She meditated at dawn. She kept her daughter close, guiding her through the fear that had once darkened their home, but she never allowed pain to define her. She carried it the way she carried every difficult truth, quietly, clearly, without shame, on Christmas Eve. Aisha stepped onto the courthouse roof. The city stretched below her, a mosaic of windows glowing against the cold. She wore a black coat. The collar lifted slightly against the wind. Her breath rose in small white clouds. The courthouse lights illuminated the faint scars on her wrists as she touched them, not with sorrow, but with reflection. She looked toward the horizon, where the bridges shimmered under winter fog. She remembered her father's beating in 1992. She remembered the humiliation of that morning at the magnetometer. She remembered the fear in her daughter's eyes when security moved them to the federal hotel. She remembered the silence of the courtroom as her assault played on the monitors. She remembered the sentences she had delivered. She remembered each cost along the way, and she spoke softly into the wind, her voice carrying the weight of every moment that brought her here. "I didn't break the blue wall," she said. "I just made sure the next black woman who walks through those doors doesn't have to bleed to do her job." She let the words settle into the cold air. They did not drift away. They stayed. They belonged to the building now, to the city, to the history she had shaped. After standing for several minutes, she turned and walked back inside. Her steps were quiet, but they carried the steadiness of someone who refused to be undone by what she had endured. She returned to her chambers, where a single desk lamp cast a warm light across a stack of new case files. She removed her coat, smoothed her sleeves, and sat down, outside. Holiday songs drifted faintly from passing cars, inside. She opened the first file, a civil rights complaint filed by a young man from Harlem. A search gone wrong, a pattern too familiar. She examined the facts with care. She took notes in crisp, deliberate lines. She paused only to sip a cup of tea that had long since cooled. The night grew deeper. The courthouse lights glowed against the frost, and Aisha continued her work. Not out of obligation, but out of purpose. She understood something clearly now. Justice is not an achievement. It is a practice, a discipline, a commitment renewed each day. The trial had ended, but her duty had not. She lifted her pen, turned to the next page, and read with steady focus. One case ended, another began, and beneath the weight of both, she remained the same, a woman who had confronted a system, borne its retaliation, endured its cost, and risen, not for herself, but for everyone who would follow. The work, she knew, was never finished, and that truth, spoken without fear, was her legacy. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it moved you, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Your support helps these stories reach more people and keeps this work going.